All righty, we're just at 12 o'clock. We'll give folks a couple minutes to join, but I'm going to officially welcome you all out to the Utah Historical Society's Perspective Speaker Series. My name is Catherine Kitterman, and I manage the Women's History Initiative here at the Historical Society. And we're so excited to be joined by Barbara Jones Brown today for our speaker, who I'll introduce a little bit later. It's really fitting to gather today on an anniversary on September 11th, 1857. So 167 years ago today, a group of Mormon settlers in Southwest Utah used false promises of protection to coax a party of California-bound immigrants from their encircled wagons and massacre them. The slaughter left the corpses of some 100 men, women, and children strewn across a highland valley called Mountain Meadows. Almost immediately after the atrocity, both non-Mormons and Latter-day Saints who were not involved in the atrocity began speculating about the motive behind it. And a close examination of events that took place after the massacre debunks prior speculative motives and provides a new interpretation. This is why we've invited Barbara Jones Brown to speak to us today. She is the director of Signature Books Publishing. Previously, she was the executive director of the Mormon History Association and historical director of Better Days 2020. She's co-author with Rick Turley of the book you see here, Vengeance is Mine, The Mountain Meadows Massacre and Its Aftermath, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. Back in 2012, Barbara received an Outstanding Achievement Award from Utah's Board of State History for her work in achieving National Historic Landmark status for the Mountain Meadows. Brown earned a master's degree in U.S. history from the University of Utah and a bachelor's degree in journalism and English from Brigham Young University. We're so pleased to have Barbara here to speak to us. I'll turn the time over to her, but just want to remind folks that we're glad to have you participate and join. If you have questions for her, we'll have time for those afterward. And if you can put those in the Q&A box, we'll make sure that we get to those as she finishes her talk. And now we'll hear from Barbara.
Thank you, Catherine. It's an honor to be asked to speak today, particularly on September 11th, which, as Catherine mentioned, is the 167th anniversary of the horrific Mountain Meadows Massacre, in which some 100 innocent men, women, and children were killed at the Mountain Meadows in Southwest Utah. I thank the Utah Historical Society for asking me to speak today, and also for giving us the platform to share our research, because we want everyone in Utah and everyone in the country to know about this event and to remember it and learn from it and never forget it. So thank you very much for inviting me here today. And again, for all of you who are joining to learn more about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. As Catherine also mentioned, almost immediately after this atrocity on September 11th, 1857, both non-Mormons and Latter-day Saints started looking for the motive behind this. How could this have happened? And there was a lot of speculation going on. On the non-Mormon side, after word of the massacre reached Los Angeles and other parts of Southern California, within a few weeks of the crime, the Los Angeles Star newspaper reported, quote, that a general belief pervades the public mind here that the Indians were instigated to this crime by the destroying angels of the church, and that the blow fell on these immigrants from Arkansas in retribution for the death of Apostle Parley Pratt, which took place in Arkansas in May 1857. Though the Star's editors acknowledged that the truth of the matter will not be known until the government make an investigation of the affair, this speculation about this motive took hold and was propagated for generations, including in Will Bagley's 2002 book, Blood of the Prophets, Brigham Young and the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and in John Krakauer's extremely popular 2004 book and recent miniseries with the same name, Under the Banner of Heaven. So this interpretation of motive maintains that it was a religious belief or religious fanaticism that led Mormons to commit the massacre. So on the other hand, Latter-day Saints who weren't involved in the massacre, who did not participate in the massacre, they quickly latched onto a rumored motive that miscreant immigrants, or the people in the train, and by immigrants, I mean people who were crossing the country, not immigrants, but immigrants, people who were traveling towards California, that these, quote, miscreant immigrants had poisoned an ox and spraying at the Corn Creek campground in central Utah near Fillmore, and that they had been attacked by the Indians in revenge for that poisoning. This interpretation of motive by Latter-day Saints relies on racialized 19th century stereotypes of indigenous peoples as savages and of outsiders or Gentiles' eagerness to persecute and kill Mormons and Indians. A close examination of events that took place after the Mountain Meadows Massacre debunks both of these speculative motives. First, of the many justifications and reasons that perpetrators and other Mormons gave for the massacre, not one of them mentioned Parley Pratt's murder as a motive. Perhaps most telling was a statement given by massacre leader John D. Lee during his 1875 trial for the massacre. Some court watchers thought that Lee's written confession, through which he attempted to avoid prosecution by turning state's evidence and becoming a witness for the prosecution, people thought that his confession would support the nearly 20-year-old theory then that the massacre was instigated by Brigham Young as a means of revenge upon the people of Arkansas for the murder of Pratt in Arkansas. Instead, Lee said nothing about Pratt and implicated only his Southern Utah co-conspirators for planning and carrying out the massacre. As for the poisoning motive, in 1859, Young's replacement as Utah's superintendent of Indian Affairs, Jacob Forney, investigated the supposed poisoning at Corn Creek. Forney concluded that while some Pavant Indians had in fact died from eating a dead ox, the Arkansas immigrants had given them at Corn Creek. This did not lead them to participate in the massacre. Quote, I have not been apprised that this excited any of them against the immigrants, Forney wrote. And after strict inquiry, I cannot learn that even one Pavant Indian was present at the massacre. Forney surmised that the ox must have eaten a poisonous weed, then died while the Arkansas train was camped at Corn Creek. With no understanding of germ theory in mid-19th century America, people could only guess at what caused the mysterious illness and deaths of cattle and people that summer at Corn Creek. Along the trail from Utah to Southern California during the mid to late 1850s, people died or became seriously ill after handling cattle carcasses. In fact, one member of this Arkansas train, Peter Huff, died on the plains before they reached Utah of a similar mysterious illness after skinning one of the cattle in the train that had died. After reviewing this circumstance and many other sources describing these symptoms documented in cases from the 1850s, modern medical experts concluded that anthrax, a naturally occurring disease borne by cattle and passed to humans, was actually the likely culprit. So though Forney was wrong about a poisonous weed being the cause of the Corn Creek deaths, he was right when he concluded that some used the incident to shift motive and blame from the actual massacre participants to Indians and even to the massacre victims themselves because they had supposedly given Indians a poisoned ox knowingly. So now that we've traced and debunked these two early speculative motives for the massacre, let's look at a previously undefined and politically motivated one, brought to the surface by a closer examination of other events that took place after the massacre. On or about October 3rd, 1857, so just a few weeks after the Mountain Meadows Massacre, LDS Indian missionaries from southwestern Utah led Moapa Indians in raiding the cattle of a California-bound immigrant company called the Dukes Train in the desert southwest of the Mountain Meadows. So right here at what was called Big Wash near there, this raid took place. Though no one was hurt in this assault, at least one of these Indian missionaries had just participated in the Mountain Meadows Massacre 3 weeks earlier, and that was Dudley Levitt, who coincidentally is Juanita Brooks's grandfather. Juanita Brooks being the historian who wrote the groundbreaking book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1950. So this combined train of immigrants from Missouri, Texas, and Arkansas had already come under another attack twice before on September 8th, 1857 in Beaver, Utah, and again on its outskirts. This combined group of 3 smaller trains had corralled their wagons in these earlier attacks near Beaver, dug pits inside for self-defense, and made preparations for a fight. Simultaneously, the same thing is going on with a different wagon train at the Mountain Meadows. In Beaver, a native leader called Ammon, recently returned from meeting Brigham Young in Salt Lake City, came to the camp with Beaver's bishop, Philo Farnsworth, to negotiate an end to the standoff. All was peace, Ammon said, and then demanded livestock. After turning over 6 head of cattle and a horse, the combined Duke's train was able to continue its journey. But again, they were attacked again and their cattle raided on October 3rd, further south here. About the same time in northern Utah, yet another company of immigrants came under attack at 2 different sites on the northern route to California. So up here near the current present-day border of Idaho. Quote, "We was suddenly aroused by the firing of guns and the yelling of the invaders," an immigrant on the northern route recorded about this attack on September 9th. The raiders had run between the immigrants' camp and their herd in the darkness, quote, "firing about 15 or 16 gunshots and yelling at a considerable rate," this immigrant wrote. "The intention of them was without a doubt to stampede our stock, not to kill any cattle or any person, but simply to steal as many as they could. In the morning, when the immigrants," whoops, I lost my screen. Let's see. And someone help me.
Still see you. We still see you loud and clear here.
Yeah, I'm just trying to bring in the photos that I was sharing. Resume share. There we go. Sorry about that. So in the morning, after this immigrant company was attacked near the border of Idaho on September 8th, the next morning, the immigrants saw tracks of shod horses and 1 or 2 pairs of boots. They concluded that at least some of their raiders were white men. They were attacked again a second time on September 10th. And then on September 12th, 1857, Apostle George A. Smith wrote from Salt Lake City to Parowan Stake President William H. Dame that Shoshone there had stolen, quote, "a host of cattle from passing immigrants." Finally, non-Mormon merchant William Bell's company was the last known to pass through the territory in the fall of 1857, leaving Salt Lake for California on November 8th. Having learned in late September of the horror of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Brigham Young wrote to Southern Utah requesting that Southern Indian Mission President Jacob Hamlin guide this company through. Quote, "I wish Mr. Bell and company to pass safely to San Bernardino with all their effects," Young made clear. When the Bell company neared the area where the Duke's train had been raided on October 3rd, so down here, Hamlin rode out ahead. At the Muddy River, he met 2 Mormon missionaries who had recently come there from Cedar City. Hamlin had trouble convincing them that the approaching Bell Company should not be attacked. Quote, "A plan had been laid and matured in their minds to kill off this company and take the spoil," Hamlin said. I told them the instructions I had from Brigham Young, but they held out the idea to me that there was secret instructions that I knew nothing of. Hamlin wrote that he only narrowly avoided this contemplated attack on the Bell Company. The multiple attacks and near attack on various emigrant companies in the fall of 1857 make clear that the company massacred at the Mountain Meadows was not the only one targeted at this time. So why the multiple attacks? And you can see all of them here are marked by stars, where all of these attacks took place simultaneously. So why these multiple attacks on multiple trains at multiple locations in Utah at the same time? The answer lies in an examination of the context and contemporary sources, which I'll explain now. In the summer of 1857, believing Utah Territory to be in a state of substantial rebellion, President James Buchanan had sent U.S. troops and a new governor and superintendent of Indian Affairs to replace Brigham Young in those capacities. Hearing that 2,500 troops were destined for Utah and receiving no explanation from President Buchanan, the Saints feared the army was coming to drive or destroy them, or at best threaten the independence they had sought when they had come to Utah beginning in 1847. The distress of being driven from Missouri and Illinois violently was still raw in their minds, as were more recent rumors that federal troops would someday come to drive the Latter-day Saints from the now developed Salt Lake Valley. While Utah would accept his replacement and the other new federal appointees on their way if they would, quote, behave themselves, Young said, he and his advisors devised strategies to keep the troops out. So again, they're willing to let the federal officials in. They just don't want the troops to occupy Utah. They come up with these strategies to keep the troops out and persuade Washington to pull the troops back. So what were these strategies? First, Mormon militiamen would slow the army's approach by intercepting their supply trains and burning the prairie grass their animals needed to survive. If they could keep the troops from entering Utah's settlements before the snows stalled them on the plains, Young reasoned, he and his people could buy time until the American public and Congress might turn against Buchanan's decision to send an army to occupy Utah. Second, if the troops could make it through, or if they did make it through, the Saints would lay their settlements in ashes and flee to the mountains or some other remote region. The third element of Young's resistance strategy involved Native people. As Utah's superintendent of Indian Affairs, Young had frequently mediated disputes between immigrant parties and local Indians prior to August 1857. When conflicts broke out, interpreters would distribute food and gifts to conciliate Indians. But as federal troops approached Utah, Young decided he would no longer do so. He first alluded to this policy change in his August 11th, 1857 diary, saying that, quote, unless the government assumes a more pacific attitude toward Utah or peaceful attitude toward Utah, he would declare emigration by the overland route stopped. Based on 19th century racial stereotypes, Young surmised that immigrants' fears of Indian cattle raiding would stop the Western emigration to California that was then so crucial to the expansionist goals of the United States. You've all heard of manifest destiny in school. This is the era of manifest destiny. And so Young knew if he could cut off immigration across the country, those goals would be thwarted. Young and his advisors believed that the Mormons' strategic position astride America's transcontinental immigration routes or trails gave them their best leverage in negotiating with Washington, D.C. to keep federal troops out of Utah. Young publicly laid out these resistance strategies the following Sunday, August 16th, when thousands of Latter-day Saints, non-Mormons, and newspaper reporters packed Salt Lake City's Bowery to hear his regular Sabbath day address. And this Bowery was located where the present-day tabernacle stands today. Young spoke of how he had heretofore endeavored to keep the trails through Utah safe for immigration, declaring that Mormon influence prevented Indians from robbing or killing immigrants. But now, if the United States send their army here, Young said, cross-continental travel must cease. If the armies come, Young told his audience, then write to your friends. Don't try to cross this continent. I will not hold the Indians still while you shoot them as you have hitherto, but I will say to them, go and do as you please. Young wanted these strategies widely circulated. Report it, he urged newspaper reporters in the audience. Publish it abroad. Though Young simply declared he would no longer hold the Indians back, privately, his interpreter, Dimmick Huntington, encouraged local tribes to participate in raiding immigrant livestock. On August 11th, that same day that Young recorded his policy change in his journal, Huntington surprised a Shoshone leader in northern Utah when he told him Young did not disapprove of the band's recent raid of immigrant livestock. At the end of August, Young again sent Huntington north to meet with the Shoshone. And as background, I wanted to explain that there were two routes that passed through Utah in the 1850s. So immigrants who were crossing the plains from the east to the west, they could come into Salt Lake City, and then they could either take what was called the northern route to Central California, or they could take the southern route, which is essentially I-15 today in Utah. They could take the southern route south to Las Vegas and eventually Los Angeles in Southern California. So at the end of August, Huntington goes north to meet with the Shoshone, and there he wrote in his journal, he met with them and, quote, gave them all the beef cattle and horses that was on the road to California, the northern route. And this was the homelands of the Shoshone people. He encouraged them to raid immigrant livestock and drive it into the mountains here. Surprised at the Mormon leaders' about-face teaching, some Shoshone replied that this was something new, and they wanted to counsel and think of it. Others told Huntington to, quote, tell Brother Brigham that we are his friends and that he can depend on us. A day or two later, on September 1st, about a dozen Pavant and Paiute Indians of central and southwestern Utah, brought to Salt Lake by Southern Indian Mission President Jacob Hamlin, met with Young and Huntington in Young's office. In that meeting, Huntington gave them all the cattle that had gone to California on the southern route. These Indians opened their eyes wide in surprise, responding, but you have told us not to steal. So I have, Huntington answered, but now the Americans have come to fight us. So he says it's a different circumstance. We're at war with the federal troops. Everything's changed. As I earlier described, in just 3.5 weeks between September 7th and October 3rd, 1857, several attacks took place on immigrant cattle companies in Utah Territory, and another was narrowly avoided in November. Only the one resulted in a massacre after an initial September 7th attack on the company at the Mountain Meadows did not go as planned. Rather than simply running off the cattle, several immigrants were murdered, and the immigrants encircled their wagons and dug in. Cedar City State President, which is near the Mountain Meadows, Isaac Haight, who was also a militia major, He sent an express to Brigham Young, an express rider, asking what to do about these besieged immigrants. Young replied on September 10th, quote, "In regard to immigrant trains passing through our settlements, you must not meddle with them. The Indians we expect will do as they please," parroting his language he's been using since August. "But if those immigrants who are there will leave, let them go in peace." Tragically, Brigham Young's letter arrived in Cedar City too late. It arrived on September 13th. Before it arrived, the local leaders in southern Utah made the horrible decision that because witnesses inside that wagon corral at the Mountain Meadows knew that white men were involved in these cattle raids and had actually killed some of their number, they feared that if they let these immigrants go to Southern California, they would raise an army from the south and threaten the Latter-day Saints from the south when an army was already coming from the north. And in this atmosphere of war hysteria, they decided that that was the danger in letting them go, quote. They concluded that they needed to orchestrate the massacre of all the witnesses within the corral old enough, quote, to tell tales as a cover-up of white Mormons' involvement, and then they would saddle the blame for the massacre on the local Paiute people. Young had written that he starts hearing about these raids, and Young writes Washington that, quote, "The sound of war quickens the blood and nerves of an Indian," he alleged, playing again on these 19th century stereotypes. The report that troops were wending their way to this territory has had its influence upon them. In one or two instances, this was the reason assigned why they made the attacks, which they did upon some herds of cattle. They seemed to think if it was to be war, they might as well commence and begin to lay in a supply of food, he wrote. If Washington would only heed his advice, Young urged, travelers could pass through Utah and no Indian would disturb or molest them. I tell them not to do it to cease their contentions and shedding of blood, but I can hold them no longer. If President Buchanan would only respect the saints' rights, travel will be stopped across, did not respect the saints' rights, travel will be stopped across the continent. The deserts of Utah will become a battleground for freedom. It's peace and our rights or the knife and tomahawk. Let Uncle Sam choose, close quote. So on September 11th, a group of about 50 to 60 militiamen from Cedar City, Santa Clara, and Washington participated in the murder of these innocent people from Arkansas who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They did nothing to warrant the crime that was perpetrated against them. And that's very important to us to make that clear and debunk prior rumors and stories that they had done anything to deserve this fate. John D. Lee visited Brigham Young on September 29th in his 1857 in his Salt Lake City office. John D. Lee had been one of the perpetrators of the crime, so he knew well the realities of what happened. But he lied about it in an effort to cover it up because Young had sent a letter saying, let these immigrants pass, don't meddle with them. So Young blamed the massacre, John D. Lee, too Young, blamed the massacre entirely on Indians and on the immigrants' behavior, including their supposed poisoning of a spring. Shocked, Young interrupted Lee's chilling account. And in this meeting, we had Brigham Young and the assistant church historian at the time, Wilford Woodruff, who recorded this whole interchange in his journal that day. So Young stops Lee's chilling account and says that this despite Lee's horrible accusations against the immigrants. Young said that the story of their slaughter was heartrending and that emigration must stop, as he had before said. Young left that meeting at 11:30 a.m., a clerk recorded, feeling ill. He may have recognized that his policy of encouraging cattle raiding, he said, we don't want to shed a drop of blood, but he may have recognized that his encouragement of the cattle raiding led to this horrific massacre. From that point on, his efforts to engage Indians in raiding immigrant cattle and fighting U.S. troops ceased. In conclusion, it was not religious fanaticism. It was not anti-Mormon aggression by Gentile immigrants, and it was not Native American savagery, but political conflict between Utah and the federal government that ultimately resulted in this unintended massacre of innocent men, women, and children. Had the attack on the company at Mountain Meadows just been a cattle raid and not gone murderously awry, Young's wartime cattle raiding strategy might have gone largely forgotten. Instead, the Mountain Meadows Massacre would haunt Young, his legacy, and his people for generations. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That is really interesting to hear the research that you folks have pieced together. And I just want to encourage folks, if they have questions, to pop them into the Q&A box down here on the bottom. We have a lot of questions to get through as well here on my end. But one of the questions that we wanted to ask you is, what sources were most helpful in your research? Again, as you've mentioned, so many folks had written about this in the past. So what was most helpful for you in uncovering a different side of the story or a new perspective on those justifications that have been given previously?
Absolutely. So my co-author and I, Rick Turley, wrote this book independently. We had no one review our book other than our peer reviewers that we asked to, and Oxford University Press, our publisher, also gave it to peer reviewers as well, so we could address any of their comments and feedback. So we wrote it independently, but the research for this book and its prequel called Massacre in Mountain Meadows was performed in the LDS Church History Department. So there was an incredible advantage with having it performed by the department. There was funding for researchers to scour the country. We found information in archives in 33 states across the United States. So
Wow.
we had that archival information from all over the place. So having this team of researchers gave us an incredible advantage that we were then able to comb through all of that research. They built an incredible chronology of events that took place every single day, starting from like the 1840s all the way through the 1880s when our book concludes. And so we have the advantage of all that research and this chronology to work from. We also were given access to documents that Juanita Brooks tried to get access to and was denied in the 1940s. In the 1940s, the church was still taking a stance of, we don't want to talk about this, we don't want to share, we just want it to go away. And of course, there's a different attitude at this time, which is, let's just make bare all of this information, shine as much sunshine as we can on this topic, because that is the only way to truly move past a horrific tragedy like this, is to talk about it, own it, apologize for it, and then share that information with the world. So we were given access to incredible primary documents that had been gathered in the 1800s, statements from perpetrators of the crime themselves, knowing that their statements that they were given to a historian would never be revealed during their lifetime. So they were very forthcoming and even self-incriminating in sharing a lot of information about the massacre and the motives behind it and so forth. We also were blessed to have a colleague named Legine Purcell Carruth, who is able to read 19th century Pittman shorthand. And so she retranscribed the two trials of John D. Lee and made a new document, and these are available for anyone who wants to go online. You could go to mountainmeadowsmassacre.org and you can read through her new transcriptions of the John D. Lee trials, which are incredibly revealing because many of the participants in the massacre testified. And what we found is they often wouldn't, they try to, they wouldn't talk about their own role in the massacre, but they were willing to point the finger at others. And so by doing that, we're able to garner a lot of information as well. So that's kind of a short answer. But if anyone is interested in reading the book, Vengeance is Mine, you can look at the endnotes and see literally the thousands of sources, most of them primary sources that we relied on for our work.
Thank you. And the link for that book has been put in the chat a couple of times, so you can find it there. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to combine some that are kind of going along the same lines here. But we have one question asking about, as you talked about the rumors and stories that the immigrants had done something that led to their murder, who started the rumors of those kind of stories? What was the given
Perpetrators.
justification?
Yeah, the perpetrators of the crime. And we were able to follow, we in the book, you can see very closely, but we track how these rumors start and how they spread. And it was by the leading perpetrators of the crime who wanted to, kind of salve their consciences. And they did not want to, of course, obviously take credit for this horrific massacre of innocent people. Most of them, it turns out, were children and women. And so they start, trying to victim blame, if you will, trying to say, well, these people were doing bad things. They were poisoning springs. John D. Lee was the one who picked that up as he's traveling from southern Utah to Salt Lake City to report to Brigham Young the massacre. As he passes through Fillmore, he learns that all these cattle have died and that Indians have died who ate the cattle and that Mormons who were skinning the cattle have died. So he takes that rumor and says, oh, well, this happened just after these immigrants were camped there. And so therefore they were intentionally poisoning people. So again, victim blaming, and then again, blaming it on the Indians using these 19th century stereotypes that were false.
Wow, it's so interesting to see that you can track the growth of those stories or the spreading of them. We've got a lot of other great questions here, and I'm going to pop around a little bit to kind of keep us in the same chronology. Somebody's asking about hearing that times in Cedar City had been really hard, so they might suspect that the local psyche was also primed for keeping the troops out and allowing for this escalation. What is your read on that additional complication?
Yeah, I mean, there was a sense of war hysteria throughout Utah Territory. As these troops are approaching, Mormon leaders, instead of, in hindsight, we can say, well, they should have just said, stay calm, everything's going to be fine, but if you try to get in the mindset of these people in the 1850s, in the 1840s and 1830s, they had been violently driven out of Missouri and Illinois. So they hear that troops are coming again, which had been part of these, attacks and these conflicts with them. They, a feeling of fear and hysteria sets in. And basically, they just didn't want the troops to occupy Utah. So that feeling is all throughout the territory, and certainly it's in Cedar City. And again, so that leads to this horrible decision of, oh wow, now some of these immigrants at Mountain Meadows, this cattle raid goes awry. They know that we're involved. If we let them go, and this is literally quotes that they're saying as they're reasoning what to do, and they make this horrible decision. They say, if we let them go, then people are going to come here and want to kill our women and children, and why not theirs instead of ours? I mean, it's really chilling language, but there's definitely this fear in this setting of war hysteria. So,
Wow, and you can really see that escalation of violence. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
exactly. Exactly. And then afterwards, local people take the wagons, and they tend to be the leaders in Cedar City, take the wagons, which, in our day would be like getting a new car. So they take the wagons. Most of the cattle ends up on John D. Lee's range at Harmony. And Lee, this is according to his biographer, Juanita Brooks, we also did the same thing, but he sees a dramatic increase in his wealth. Was the wealth the primary motive for going out there and doing this? We didn't find that, but that was definitely, they took all those possessions afterwards, and that was definitely kind of a side benefit, if you will. for the leaders of the crime. Much of the property was brought back and put in the tithing house in Cedar City, which was a distribution place for distributing goods to people in need. And it's stored in the tithing house until a couple of months later when it's all auctioned off to the local people who are living in a state of extreme poverty. They were settling Cedar City, trying to start an iron mission. It wasn't going well. And so people clamored for those goods that they otherwise couldn't get or couldn't afford. So, and again, I'm just skimming over the top here, but this is all detailed thoroughly in the book if people want to learn more.
Thank you. We have another question about misconceptions about the massacre, and you've debunked several, or you've talked about how some of them grew, but this question is wondering if there are misconceptions that you still see perpetuated today in 2024.
Less and less. And that's what, I appreciate this opportunity to speak. My co-author and I, Rick Turley, are speaking. I just spoke about it last night. We're guiding a tour of the Mountain Meadows this Saturday. I'm so grateful that we continue to have opportunities to share our research, because one of the primary things we want to do is debunk myths about the immigrants and about Native American peoples as well, who have borne the brunt of this for far too long. So sometimes there is still the perception that it was just, oh, these crazy Mormons, religious fanaticism. They just wanted to wipe out people from Arkansas because an apostle had been killed in Arkansas. We show that the person who killed Parley P. Pratt in Arkansas was actually from San Francisco. His name was Hector McLean, and he's tracking down Parley and following him across the country. He just happens to catch up with him in Arkansas and murders him. Parley had taken as a plural wife Hector McLean's estranged wife. And so McLean murders him. It happened in Arkansas, but it had nothing to do with the people of Arkansas. But our research just showed that had nothing to do with it. So we're trying to debunk that perception that continues today. And again, any perceptions that the immigrants had anything to do with deserving this crime. And we just want to make clear that they were innocent. That's very important to us to do. So.
Thank you. There's some other questions here that have come in that kind of go around the same theme here that you're talking about, but there's a conference starting tomorrow in St. George, which it sounds like you're involved with, right? But one theme of which is making peace, in
Yes.
quotes, with Mountain Meadows. And
Yes.
the questioner is asking what your take on that idea is, having spent so much time on this subject.
So this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. And I know some of my friends who are descendants of victims of the crime are watching today, and I thank them for joining us as well. But I have, become emotional, but I've had the privilege of becoming dear friends with many descendants of the victims, which has meant a great deal to me. And those friendships, we have worked together to seek healing and reconciliation. And as I have asked them, what can I do? What can we do to seek healing and peace and reconciliation? And there's generally two things that they've asked, that they've said we can do. The first is tell the story and tell the truth about our people. And so that's what we have done. That's what we are doing. And we are constantly seeking to spread the word about the Mountain Meadows Massacre and the truth about it. Secondly is to protect the Mountain Meadows where the remains of their ancestors still lie today. And we have done that as well as we have worked together with descendants groups to seek National Historic Landmark status for the Mountain Meadows, which we did obtain. And that ensures that the Mountain Meadows is protected. It can never be developed. And the burial place of their ancestors will always be protected and safe. And so that's been a great privilege of my life to be involved with the descendants of victims. And these friendships have been meant a great deal to me. When I was working on the book, and many others who were working on the book, these two books, we were feeling horrible PTSD-like symptoms, nightmares, horror, feeling just horrible about what had happened. But and a lot of that came from feeling like there's nothing I can do. I can't get in a time machine and go back and change this. But when I started to meet descendants of victims and forming friendships with them, I realized there was something that I could do for these victims, and that was to reach out to their descendants and seek peace and healing and reconciliation with their descendants.
That's beautifully put. Thank you for sharing. We've got another question here about what was known at the time in terms of the government, or I would imagine maybe they might even be thinking about the wider US population.
Mhm.
Did people find out about the massacre during that time, or was it hidden until the story was exposed with Juanita
Yeah.
Brooks and others?
Yeah, I mean, here's the irony is these Southern Utah leaders thought, oh, we need to cover this up and kill all these witnesses and blame it on the local Indians so that no one will know of white Mormons' involvement. But almost as soon as the massacre happens, word of it, I mentioned the Duke's train that had been traveling behind the train massacre to Mountain Meadows. They reached Southern California and they figured the whole thing out. They've kind of pieced it together, and they're convinced that white Mormons are involved in the massacre. And so newspapers in Southern California start publishing the story. And these newspaper reports are picked up and they spread across the nation. When people in Arkansas who are relatives of the people who were massacred in Mountain Meadows, they learn about the massacre, they're horrified, they're heartbroken, but they also learn reports that some children had been spared. And so they write their congressional delegation and ask the federal government to help investigate and to find these children that were reportedly spared, and so that they can be brought back to their families. I talked about Jacob Forney being going south and investigating the massacre in 1859. He's also going south to collect these surviving children, which Jacob Hamlin has helped him collect, and he returns them to their families in 1859. During that investigation and other federal investigators in 1859, they basically put together the whole story through interviewing John D. Lee, Isaac Haight, other leaders and other participants, and talking to Native Americans. They put together the story, and but Brigham Young chooses not to believe their reports from the federal government. He chooses to trust his own people. Again, there's this extreme distrust of the federal government at the time. And he believes his people who were leaders of the massacre, and they're lying to him about what actually happened.
Thank you for sharing that. We have a question here coming from an educator about if you have suggestions for talking about Mountain Meadows with fourth graders and seventh graders. The question just says that this is an important Utah history topic, and as you know, those are the grades where Utah Studies is taught. So given the complicated context and violence, how might you approach this topic with young people?
Yes, I think different ages groups, you can go into different detail, right? With fourth graders, kids are pretty young. I I think we need to trust that kids can handle things. And of course, we don't need to go into graphic violent details with young children, but I think just explaining what was going on at the time, and explaining how misperceptions and violent rhetoric and having an us versus them mentality can lead to tragedies, and can lead to violence, and teaching kids about this. So it's not just so much knowing about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but then knowing about okay, what does that mean for us today? And I think kids can handle it. I have as I was writing this, I had young children, and I was telling them about it, not the horrific details, of course, which we do go into in the book. Um, but I think just helping people, including young children, understand that this did happen, and saying the only way to, none of us alive are responsible for the massacre today, right? But we are all responsible for how we deal with it today. And it is wrong to try and excuse what happened. We don't want to try and rehabilitate any of the leaders of the crime, making excuses for them, but rather it's important to say this happened, own it, and then say sorry that it happened rather than try to excuse it. And then only then can we truly move on by knowing the truth about this. But what are the repercussions for it? What can we learn from it today is very important to teach kids, I think.
Great answer. We'd like to also ask what happened to some of the perpetrators. I realize there's a lot of detail in your book. We can't go into everything here, but just in general, if you could take us through the aftermath as it played out in their lives.
Sure. And we do follow the fate of all of the perpetrators as much as information was available all the way through the 1880s. In fact, our last chapter is called Haunted, and we follow the lives of the perpetrators. So eventually, only 9 men are indicted for the crime. And these 9 men, they either are brought to trial, but there either is not enough evidence to convict them. In the case of William H. Dame, who gave a verbal okay to Isaac Haight to go ahead and call out the militia to carry out the massacre. He turned himself in, but there was just no written or hard evidence to convict him, so he was let go. John D. Lee was caught, and there was plenty of evidence, eyewitnesses of people who saw him actually murder people at the Mountain Meadows Massacre. He's eventually convicted and executed for the crime. Unfortunately, he was the only one who was brought to justice for the crime, but there were many others that should have been. And then other men lived on the lam their whole lives, lived in hiding their whole lives. Isaac Haight, who was a linchpin in the crime, he is never caught. Philip Klingensmith, who was also another leader, he turns state's evidence and offers to, on the behalf of the prosecution, to testify against his fellow co-conspirators. And so he is off because he turns state's evidence. So, but we followed some of the smaller or the lesser perpetrators of the crime who were just doing what they were told to do once they got out there. And many lived horrifically sad lives. They were haunted by what happened to them for the rest of their lives. And in fact, we close the very last story in our book is about one of these perpetrators named Nephi Johnson. He was a young man at the time of the massacre. He was called out to the Mountain Meadows he didn't want to go, but he went and did what he was told. And we have this incredible story of how he's on his deathbed. And he calls for the little school teacher that lives in his community because he wants to tell her his story. And when she arrives at his deathbed, he's delirious. This is in 1919. I've since wondered after our pandemic if it was from the flu of 1919. But he's lying on his deathbed, and he's delirious and feverish, and he's looking at the ceiling. And at one point he screams, "Blood, blood, blood." And this little school teacher who's there by his side says to a local ranch hand, "What is wrong with Brother Johnson? He acts like he is haunted." And the ranch hand says, "Maybe he is. He was at the Mountain Meadows Massacre, you know." Well, this little school teacher did not know. Her name was Juanita Brooks. She was 19 at the time. And because of that incident in her life, she goes on to later investigate and write the first scholarly work on the book. So that's how we close our book. So yeah, people can, again, we have a whole, the ending chapters go into all of this. And so people can learn more about the fate of the perpetrators.
I've got two last questions here, unless we have other things pop up in the Q&A box, but you've already covered so much. And you've mentioned some of the new sources that you looked at and the things that were most helpful. We wanted to know also what surprised you in your research for this book specifically. You'd been involved again for a long time and knew a lot of the story, I assume, or knew a lot of what you thought was the story. We'd just like to know what was surprising to you as you prepared this
So
manuscript.
many surprises. So I'll just try and skim over them quickly. So I was the editor of the first book in this series that was called Massacre in Mountain Meadows. But it wasn't until we started for the second book, which is essentially about the massacre and its aftermath, I started looking at things that happened afterwards, and I was really surprised. Namely, I was surprised by that October 3rd attack and raid of cattle by some of the same people who were at Mountain Meadows. They did it again, only this time they just ran off cattle. They didn't kill anybody. I was stunned to see that. And then that's when I started looking and discovered, oh, wait, all of these attacks are going on at the same time. There is a different motive. Something else is going on here. So that was a big surprise. And it led to this new motive, this new interpretation of motive behind it. Another thing I was very surprised to see is the people who are giving the contemporary accounts of about how many people were killed at Mountain Meadows. The numbers were 95 people, 96 people, and another one that was, I think, 95 as well. And that surprised me. These were people who did body counts immediately after the massacre, and then their accounts were documented right away. And that was surprising because the traditional number has always been 120 immigrants. But what historians have been able to track down, including descendants of victims, was they've only been able to name about 88 who were killed. And so for years, we've thought, well, who are these other 30 mysterious immigrants that no one has been able to document because of this traditional number of 120? And then I realized, wait a minute, if you look at the earliest sources, the primary sources coming from people who were there counting the bodies, it's actually closer to 95, and we actually have pretty much named all of those killed. Where did that number 120 come from? That came from James Henry Carleton's men. Army came in 1859. They interviewed Jacob Hamlin, who was not at the scene of the crime, and Hamlin estimated that, this was afterwards. He estimated, I think there's about 120 people. So that became the standard number. And then what was really surprising was we put this in our book that we believe it's actually under 100. And then later I was reading a later edition of Mountain Meadows Massacre by Juanita Brooks, and she had added a new foreword to this later edition that was published in the 1970s. And in there, she also concluded, I wasn't aware of this before, but that the number of 120 immigrants was much too high based on her research. So that was a surprise, but a good surprise, because now we know there's not so much anxiety like, oh, we've got to find these 30 other people. We can be pretty assured that that most of them have actually been named. One last surprise that I'll share was in the two trials of John D. Lee that take place in the 1870s, it becomes clear that the first set of attorneys aren't trying to convict Lee. They're not trying to get a conviction for him. They want the Mormon church to look bad. And they want, they're trying to use the massacre as a whipping stick to try and convince the federal government that, look, these Mormons, they are never going to convict one of their own. Look, they can't even convict someone involved in something as horrific as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And they actually never go after Lee. They never try to get his conviction. But in the second trial, a new attorney from Michigan that is appointed to prosecute this crime, he doesn't have a dog in that fight. He just goes after John D. Lee and gets the conviction. So, and again, you don't have to take my word for it. You can read these trials on our website, mountainmeadowsmassacre.org, and also read the book. So, but again, surprise after surprise after surprise came out through our research. So,
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. You have such a depth of knowledge on this for having been involved in so long. And we just like to ask one last question, which is, what has driven you to investigate this topic? And again, I know that answer has probably changed over the years, but as you've already mentioned, some things that are personally meaningful to you, we'd love to know that as we close out
yeah.
this
So
conversation.
I was originally hired by Rick Turley in 2005 because of my editing skills. I was a professional editor and writer, and he wanted someone to be the content editor for the first book, Massacre at Mountain Meadows. But as I started digging into that, I thought, well, if I'm going to be a good editor of this, I need to delve into the primary sources. And I just became fascinated by what it means to study history. And I loved it so much that I decided I didn't want to just edit historians. I wanted to be a historian. And so after the first book came out, I went back to graduate school and earned a master's degree. And I was working on that degree while we're writing the second book, Vengeance is Mine. So that's kind of where my interest in history came from. But what has driven me to research and get the story right was the victims of the crime never got justice. And we can't change that today, but I can bring them as much justice as possible by telling their story and investigating the perpetrators and telling the truth about what they did and exposing it for all the world. So that's what drives me, is doing this for the victims of the crime and for their relatives, and then also just hoping to increase awareness throughout the state of Utah and throughout the country.
Well, thank you so much. This is an important and compelling topic, and we really appreciate you sharing your research with us today. And And again, folks can check out the book that is in the links or other resources that she has mentioned. And we hope you'll do that and tune in for our next installment of the Perspective Speaker series in a few months. Thank you so much for your time, Barbara.
Thank you. And thank you again for the invitation.